Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg is among the federal officials who visited East Palestine since the derailment, and he joins us now. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So let's start with the federal response. Are you satisfied with it? And when you look back and reflect, is there anything that you would do differently?
Well, the first thing I want to emphasize is that we had folks on the ground in the first hours and have been with the people of East Palestine ever since. Now, the part of the answer to your question is in the years yet to come. In other words, when I talk to folks in East Palestine, people who've been impacted by this, they don't want the community to be defined by this, but also don't want to be forgotten. And what that means is not only do we need to follow through on all of the response that's taken place so far, including the EPA holding Norfolk Southern accountable for the cost of the cleanup, and our department making sure we take all safety lessons learned and incorporate them into future regulations. But it also means year after year and even a decade out or two, making sure that the community is never left alone if they have any questions or concerns about health, about safety, or about the impact of what happened there.
Okay, so when we look to the future, like you mentioned, this is something that's going to be with these residents for a long time. How do you put those parameters in place that are going to hold Norfolk Southern accountable for those, years where, you've moved on from your post, where somebody else has to look over things?
Well, this is one of the most important things is the continuity of the response. And that's where President Biden has directed us to have a whole of government approach. In other words, making sure whether it's the EPA, whether it's the NTSB, which is independently doing their investigation, whether it's our department looking at the transportation side, anyone involved in the public health aspects, that there is continuity. It doesn't matter who's in or out in terms of elected office, that this response continues. Now, the other thing, of course, we're focused on is making sure that these kinds of incidents are less likely in the future. What happened in East Palestine really woke up the country to the fact that derailments have always been a daily occurrence in this country, and we shouldn't accept that. It's one of the reasons why I think it is so important for Congress to follow through on the Railway Safety Act. It has been proposed. It's got bipartisan support. It would give our department more ability to prevent these kinds of incidents from happening, and I think it deserves to get to the president's desk. And one concern that I have, 6 months after this derailment, is that it's less in the headlines and there's less pressure to get something done. We need to keep that pressure up until there's the follow-through to make these changes so that other communities are less likely to go through the upheaval and the fear that so many in East Palestine had to live with.
All right, so when you talk about making changes, the Department of Transportation is working to finalize a rule that would require at least 2 crew members on trains. Now, the train that derailed in East Palestine did have a 2-person crew plus a trainee on board. So how would that change? How would that rule regulate and prevent derailments that we're talking about, like the one in East Palestine?
Well, we need to make so many changes and adjustments to railroad safety, and this is one of them. This is one of them that we've considered very important, which is why we've been working on it before, during, and since the response to the Norfolk Southern derailment in Ohio. Because to me, it's just common sense. We got trains that are 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, sometimes even longer. And the railroad industry wants to be able to have those trains going through communities with only 1 person on board. I just don't think that makes any sense. For years, there's been an effort to build the rule that would require at least 2. It was dropped in the last administration, but we picked it back up because we consider it important. And one thing I want to emphasize is that in a country that for years has tolerated a pace of hundreds or even thousands of derailments a year, we're not just going to implement a fix that would have helped one particular case. We're going to make sure that across the board, we're making improvements that will make a difference on everything from the strength of tank cars to the safety of the trains themselves. And by the way, the treatment of the workers who work on them. I think a healthy, well-protected workforce is also a safer workforce. It's why, a year ago when the rail labor unions were going through their negotiations, one thing that we as an administration said was we're not going to abandon the fight to get more sick leave. A year ago, barely any railroad workers had access to sick leave. Right now, that number is over 75% and growing, and we're going to keep pushing until it's 100%.
Okay. Now, a minute ago, you talked about the length of the train, right? So we know that the train was about 1.75 miles long, 149 cars. The engineer there expressed concern about that. So You know, you mentioned the length of those trains, especially those when we talk about the ones carrying hazardous materials. How specifically should those be regulated?
Well, that answer has to be informed by science, by data, and by information that historically the railroads never had to give us. We are requesting and getting more information and developing regulations. But again, they're going to be based in fact, not fear. We're going to make sure that there's an understanding of the impacts. But just common sense tells you that a train that runs more than a mile long is going to behave differently than a shorter train. And in the same way that after the deadly train crash and explosion that killed 47 people in Quebec a little over 5 years ago, there was a change to how highly flammable oil car trains are regulated. There's clearly got to be more attention on these trains that haven't fallen into that technical category. But look, you look at the images out of that derailment in East Palestine and say, if this isn't a high hazard train, I don't know what is. Which is why we also had the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration updating its work to create more appropriate controls and look to the future on safety there.
All right, so then Norfolk Southern, they are in charge of placing hot bearing detectors along its tracks, right? And has them spaced out about 20 miles apart. The Rail Safety Act of 2023, sponsored by Senator Sherrod Brown and co-sponsored by J.D. Vance, initially called for those detectors to be closer together, about 10 miles apart for trains carrying hazardous materials. Do you think that the spacing of detectors should be federally mandated? And do you think that they should be closer to that 10 number?
Well, I do think that the provisions in the Railway Safety Act would add a layer of assurance by increasing the frequency of the use of these so-called wayside defect detectors or hot box detectors. We've put out a safety advisory from the Federal Rail Administration on these and recognize that up until now there haven't been a lot of requirements around them. Railroads have used them on their own, which means there's no single standard. I believe that this will likely be a topic, although it's independent, and so I don't have inside knowledge of it, but as the NTSB looks at this and develops their report, which can take a year or longer to produce, they've already made clear that this is one of the topics that they're looking at, and so I think they may have further information for us. But I don't think we should wait on another report to come out to act on what we know. And part of what we know is that these detectors can make a difference, and it's one of the reasons why they're in that Railway Safety Act, which I believe deserves to be passed without waiting months or years for more studies to come out.
Okay, so you talk about the Safety Act there. You know, is there a holdup, and if so, what is it, and what do you need from Congress?
Well, what we see is that in both the Senate and the House, there is bipartisan interest in this. It seems to have moved further in the Senate than in the House. But again, I worry that the momentum might stall unless the pressure continues. See, the pattern we've seen in this country is that there will be a terrible derailment, sometimes even a mass casualty event, like what happened in Graniteville, South Carolina about 20 years ago, where hundreds of people were sent to the hospital by a hazardous material release. About 10 of them died. Gets a lot of headlines for a moment, and then over time, people think about it less and less. Congress moves on to other things. Washington pays attention to something else. And the railroad company, the railroad lobby succeeds in watering down a lot of these proposals. This is a moment that I think captured America's attention, and deservedly so, in a way that we can't just leave in the past just because the months or years go by. We owe it to the people of East Palestine, and we owe it to every community that lives anywhere near a railroad to toughen up these standards. That's what Congress could do. We're doing everything we can within the authorities we do have, but we're asking Congress to expand that so that we can do more.
All right, so I've visited Graniteville, spoken to the people of South Carolina there about what had happened, and like you mentioned, they're still dealing with those effects, everything from that initial impact of when it happened to today. When we look at when these derailments happen, many times first responders, unfortunately, are just not prepared. They've never had to deal with a hazardous situation. They've never been trained on it. What is your involvement in trying to make sure that first responders are trained in instances like this?
That's right. Our department is directly funding the training of first responders. We've trained thousands in the state of Ohio alone so that they're better prepared. But another way to help them be better prepared is to get them better information in the first place, to make sure local jurisdictions know when trains carrying hazardous materials are coming through their communities. This is something that we have pressed the railroads to do, even if there isn't a requirement, but we're working towards more of a structured way to make sure that happens. This is also something that's being contemplated contemplated in some of these proposals in Congress, and I think at a common sense level is something that ought to happen.
All right, then when we talk about criticism, criticism is healthy. We're criticizing, things that have happened in the past with these railroad companies. You've faced some criticism in the past for not visiting East Palestine sooner. Do you regret that decision at all? And when you did visit, did you find it valuable, even if it isn't the norm for a transportation secretary to visit the site of a train derailment?
It was very valuable for me to go. Up until then, I followed what had been the norm for transportation secretaries, which has generally been not to participate in active site response and to allow first responders and NTSB to do that. But I arrived the same day that NTSB did their initial fact-finding report. And I think that it is important, especially because of the way times have changed, the way information and sometimes misinformation moves, to really change that practice. And so on my watch, we have changed the way that our department and my office responds to this. And again, I want to emphasize, we were on the ground in the first hours, as we often are in terms of the Federal Rail Administration. But I do think having that cabinet level visit, leaving enough time for first responders to do their job without having to deal with some of what comes along with that visit, but having that visit happen at the right time to make sure people understand that this administration is very focused on their well-being. That's something that, as we've gone forward since, I've continued to integrate into how we respond to issues that require that level of attention and that level of intervention sometimes, to make sure people affected by disaster, whether it's natural or whether it's man-made, understand and see that they have the full support of the entire government.
Do you think you'd come back? Do you have an appointment on the schedule to visit East Palestine again?
I've been keeping in touch with folks I met on the ground there, and always learn a lot from the conversations that we've had. I don't have any announcements right now about travel plans to make, but certainly don't expect that the visit that I made there will be my last.
All right. Hey, we appreciate your candor. Anything you want to add?
No, covered a lot of ground there. I appreciate it. Again, I just want to make sure that whether it's 6 months on, as it is this week, or a year on, that we never forget the lessons that have been learned from this, and that the pressure does not drop to make changes that would potentially save a lot of heartbreak and maybe even save lives.
All right. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Good being with you.